I'm here to speak about the generation gap and revolution. There is a relationship. And what we're really going to speak and focus on is how we can save revolutions when they go wrong or when they turn into this. These images are from Libya, Syria, and Egypt. The image with the burning embassy at the top there is the American embassy that was attacked recently in Libya. The image with the car burning is from Egypt. The protest that rose from the anti-Islam film and the riots that were as a result of that. And the image at the bottom of a man carrying a child is in Syria, where we're practically witnessing a civil war. So when last year these revolutions, or in 2011, when these revolutions kicked off, people were optimistic. People assumed that this would lead to something positive in the region. I think in overall evolutionary terms, it's still something positive. But in the short to medium term, we're going to witness chaos in this region. And there are some decisive moves that I think we're going to have to take to prevent what was initially such a positive development from turning and spiraling into chaos. And some of that is the chaos you see on the screen right now. So the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, how can we use the generation gap as a force for change? And the relationship between generation gap and revolutions is, of course, these uprisings in the Arab world began because there was a whole host of people in these societies, youth, young people, who had expectations that weren't being met by these dictatorships. And so, of course, what results when that happens is mass upheaval and change. So generation gaps, in one sense, lead to positive change. It's not always a bad thing. But the question that we need to ask ourselves is, how can we prevent a revolution from being hijacked, as people are fearing is happening right now in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, where Al-Qaeda has resumed operations and is exploiting the uprising against the dictator there for its own nefarious purposes. And the last question I want you to consider is, how can this change outlast future generation gaps? Because, of course, the last thing we want is for a popular uprising to emerge, for people to come to power, and then for a new, younger generation to be just as disenfranchised after 80 years, and another revolution to come along, and they create something completely unheard of that could potentially be bad for the world and cause even more instability. These are the questions I want you all to focus on for this brief 18 minutes. And I suppose they revolve around what causes a civil war, because that's what we're witnessing in some of these countries at the moment, how we can then turn that into stability, what causes stability, and finally, and importantly, stability is not the same as development. You could have a stable country. Egypt was stable for many, many years, but it was under a dictatorship. It was not developing as a society. So stability is good, but it's not the final destination. We want to reach a stage where these societies are developing, where they are progressing, as one would call typically in a developing nation or a developing country. So the distinction between stability and development is crucial. What causes a civil war? Well, typically civil wars emerge when you have competing visions of the social contract, and people are prepared to fight. People are prepared to fight each other to establish their own version of that social contract. What causes stability is when a strong faction becomes dominant over the rest of those competing factions. And the strongest faction, when it emerges, establishes its writ over that society. And it establishes its own vision of the social contract over everybody else. Now, of course, this isn't the same as development, because until that social contract gets adopted by everybody else in that society, until a consensus emerges in that society, it will remain a dictatorship. And this moves me to that final question: how do you then become a developing nation? Well, the crucial thing is that we need to develop a civilizational consensus. Forgive that long word. What it really means is that everyone in that society needs to agree upon the fundamental fabric that binds that country together, or that nation, or those people. The fabric that binds people is a set of ideas that act as the framework, they act as the mechanisms, they act as the criteria for dispute resolution. Now, that civilizational consensus needs to sit above politics, because nations don't just develop by developing a consensus on party politics. In fact, a consensus on party politics is unhealthy. We know that in other terms as the one-nation state, as the one-party state. Developing a consensus in politics is unhealthy. These countries need a consensus in their civilizational framework, not in their political ideas. Their political ideas, in fact, need to be vibrant, and they have to disagree with each other. So you get a developing nation or people when you develop this civilizational consensus. That doesn't come about through a consensus on morals. It doesn't come about through a consensus on education. It doesn't come about, as I said, through party political consensus either. In fact, if you had consensus on any of these three, it would be unhealthy for that nation. And wealth doesn't bring this about either. Some of the richest countries in the world are in the Middle East, and they are also some of the last remaining absolute monarchies. So civilizational consensus is what leads that nation to move to its next phase of development. If you see this here, the outer circle, in the 50s and 60s, the Arab world experienced a period of Arab socialism, and there was a consensus emerging around Arab socialism. Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt was one of the most famous and popular presidents of the Arab world, and the trend, the trendy ideology to follow was Arab socialism. Something happened. If you now look to the second sphere, in the 80s and 90s, a new civilizational consensus began emerging in the Arab world, and that civilizational consensus became known as Islamism. And so it's no surprise when we look back, and some of us who are old enough to remember that the PLO used to be the Palestinian People's Representatives, and that was a secular organization. And today, if you think of what the popular movements are in a disputed area such as Palestine and Israel, you'd think of Hamas. If you look to Egypt, it's no surprise, therefore, that the Islamists, whether in Tunisia, whether in Egypt, came to power, because the consensus that used to exist was replaced by another consensus. These uprisings gave us hope for a third type of consensus. And that's this inner circle here, what I say here in the noughties and the 20s, 2020s, is democracy. Because the young people that sparked these uprisings were young Democrats. But importantly, there's a distinction between a loose coalition and a social consensus. The young people got together in the form of a loose coalition to remove a dictator, but that doesn't mean they all agreed on the vision for their country, i.e., on that civilizational consensus. In fact, we know they didn't agree because the Islamists and others, some of them still being communists, joined these young people to form a loose coalition that aspired simply to remove the ruler. Well, of course, when the dictator fell, what to bring next was the question. How did Islamism succeed in eclipsing Arab socialism as that civilizational consensus in the 80s and the 90s? Well, this is where it's time to get serious. You may be wondering why I kept my jacket on. It was precisely so I could perform this move, because we need to roll our sleeves up. What the Islamists had in the 80s and the 90s was a social movement. They were working through civil society to spread a set of cohesive ideas, and nobody else was doing it. A social movement is comprised of ideas, the values you believe in, narratives, which is essentially the propaganda for those ideas, it's not the same thing, symbols, and leaders. If you think of Al-Qaeda, it has all of these four. If you think of the ideas, we know that Al-Qaeda wants to create a pan-Islamist superstate that rules with an interpretation of their religion and forces that interpretation over the rest of society. If you think of their narratives, we know that their propaganda to other Muslim peoples is that there's a global war going on to destroy Islam and Muslims, and that to prevent the destruction of Islam and Muslims, you must join us to fight in a jihad to defend your identity and your religion. That's their propaganda, that's their narrative. They have symbols. They have symbols that represent their struggle, one of them being the AK-47, but others as well, like the black flag with the Arabic writing on it, which is actually the testimony of their faith. And they have leaders. If I ask you now to think of the face of a leader of Al-Qaeda, immediately, probably all of you here can think of the face of Osama bin Laden, even though he's dead. Now, if I ask you to do the same thing for these four ideas, narratives, symbols, and leaders for democratic movements in the Arab world and in Muslim-majority societies, I think you would struggle to think of one from any one of these four. Can you think of leaders who represent the democratic struggle in those regions? Can you think of the symbols for those social movements? Can you think of the narratives and their ideas? And the reason that you may struggle is because they haven't existed for such a long time. Instead, the only social movements that have existed in the Arab world have been those that advocate Islamism, and prior to that, Arab socialism. And that's why they've succeeded in changing, in shifting that civilizational consensus from socialism to Islamism, because they're the only ones who've been active on the ground. They've been demonstrating the potency of their ideas also through their own actions. The first people to respond to the earthquakes in Pakistan were Lashkar-e-Taiba, the terrorist organization that's banned that was behind the Mumbai attacks in India. In Hamas, they built hospitals, they built schools. At the same time, they launched terrorist operations against civilians, and they preached their ideas. They are ideas in action. They've been working through the veins of society for so long that people have begun to adopt their ideas and to believe in their narratives and to respect their leaders, and their symbols have resonance. There is no equivalent of this for democratic movements in the Middle East. This brings me to the serious work. This image here is me with two other members of the organization, the extreme Islamist organization that I spent 13 years on the leadership of. This was taken when I was being marched into prison for my trial in Egypt, and I was sentenced to 5 years as a Amnesty-adopted prisoner of conscience. And the reason Amnesty adopted our case is that the organization I worked with was not a terrorist organization, though it was an extremist organization. Like you can be racist but not violent, you can be extremist and not a terrorist. We believed in establishing our ideology, which was Islamism, the desire to impose one interpretation of our faith onto everybody else. We believed in establishing that through a military coup, which is not a terrorist act. And because we hadn't directly attempted yet a military coup in Egypt, Amnesty adopted us as prisoners of conscience. What that did for me was it opened my heart to the importance of human rights. I spent the next 4 years in prison, once my heart had opened, to then consider intellectually my beliefs and my cause. And I discussed and debated with everybody from the one end, the assassins of the former president of Egypt who were in prison with me. Anwar Sadat was killed in 1981 by a group known as Tanzim al-Jihad, through to the Muslim Brotherhood leadership who now currently run the country, through to the liberal political prisoners, all the way to the other end, people who were imprisoned for the so-called crime of being gay. Now you can imagine the conversation that the gay guys had with the assassins of the former presidents of Egypt, who were Islamist jihadists. Those 4 years helped me develop my own, mature, should I say, my own thoughts. And Amnesty's representation of me and their campaign for my release allowed me to be willing to consider change. And I often say where the heart leads, the mind can follow. And that brings me to this next photograph here. Because what I then did is, upon my release from prison, I unilaterally resigned from my leadership position in this organization. But that wasn't enough. I knew what we had done in the Middle East. I knew what we had done in Pakistan. I was one of the co-founders of my group in Pakistan. I knew how we had created those social movements I referred to, and how we had changed the civilizational discourse, how we had changed that civilizational consensus, essentially one that used to be secular, whether it was Arab socialism or not, it used to be secular, and we shifted it towards Islamism. So I knew what needed to be done to reverse that. And if there's one thing I know how to do, is to recruit people. So what I then started to do was to start building the mirror organization of the one I used to belong to, for the purpose of creating a test case, a trial case, for a social movement that instead of advocating Islamism, advocates democratic culture. At this point, I will say that elections are not the same as democratic culture. Hitler was elected. Elections merely bring to power the most popular idea. The most popular idea may not be democratic, because democracy is impossible without freedom of thought, without freedom of speech, without a respect for minorities, without your human rights guaranteed, without the freedom to campaign for your beliefs, without freedom of association to join any political party. This culture that underpins democracy is in a sense more important than the elections themselves, because the elections will come as a result of this culture being embedded in society. And what was missing in those countries wasn't that they had elections. Pakistan has elections currently, but this culture was absent in society because there was no one literally preaching these values. So what we decided to do instead was to found an organization built upon the same structure as these Islamist groups, called Khudi. And that's what brings me to this photograph here. This image was taken last Sunday. How many of you have heard of the 14-year-old girl that was shot in the head by the Taliban? She was targeted and shot at point-blank range, and according to the Taliban, they shot her not because she campaigned for female education, though that's also what she did, but because, quote, she believed in secularism and advocated a Western democratic agenda. They hunted her down and they shot her at point-blank range in the head in the city of Mingora in Swat, the region of Pakistan. This photograph was from last Sunday in Swat, in Mingora, in Pakistan, and this group of people are the team we have there working every day to advocate for democratic values. And they are the Swat chapter of Khudi, the organization which we have founded in Pakistan to reverse this Islamist civilizational consensus in an attempt to bring about the democratic civilizational consensus. That requires hard work. That requires commitment and sacrifice. But we believe something. Why develop the democratic civilizational consensus? Why not pick something else? Why not pick Islamism? Why not pick socialism, communism? Because coming back now to the theme of this TEDx today, the only system that I believe absorbs and caters for the competing factions we spoke about earlier that are fighting over their vision of the social contract, the only system that is able to incorporate different generations, and then that last question I asked at the beginning, how can revolutions transcend the generation gap and last beyond different generations? I believe the only system that can do that is the democratic culture and the democratic system, because it has this ability, it has mechanisms to incorporate these differences, to bring everybody on board, to provide mechanisms for dispute resolution, and to provide young people with a stake in society. But if that vision is to be achieved, we have to fight for it, and we have to be prepared to die for it, as hard and as tough as the extremists fight for their cause and are prepared to die for their cause. And with those remarks, I'll conclude. Thank you very much.